If you live in the UK and you're interested in art, you've probably heard the name Henry Tate. Two of the biggest art galleries in London are named after him. There's also a gallery named after him in Liverpool and in St Ives. He founded a series of libraries in South London. There's a bust of his head on Windrush Square in Brixton, and there's even a Wetherspoons pub named after him. Who was this man? Why do we honour his name? And how could he afford to build all these galleries and libraries? Firstly, I'm going to go over a very brief outline of how Tate made his fortune. According to trusty Wikipedia, Henry Tate was born in 1819 in Lancashire. He was the son of a reverend. At the age of 35, he owned a chain of successful shops in Liverpool. By 1869, he'd sold those shops and established the sugar company, Henry Tate and Sons. In 1872, business boomed as he secured a German patent for the sugar cube and was introducing it to the British market. In 1877, he opened a massive sugar refinery in East London, which is still producing sugar to this day. And in 1889, he donated his collection of 65 paintings to the British government, along with £80,000 in order to build the National Gallery for British Art, nowadays referred to as the Tate Britain. Wikipedia makes this all seem very wholesome, but obviously when you think of British sugar merchants from the 19th century who were immensely wealthy, we kind of assume that they've probably got some sort of deep ties to the Atlantic slave trade. So I did a bit of Googling and I found out that it's actually quite a heated issue. The first thing I found was a rather stubborn article in The Guardian, which pointed out that Henry Tate was 14 years old when slavery was abolished in the British Empire and that he never owned slaves or land in the Caribbean. The article was pretty salty and it said it was an insult on the memory of Henry Tate to suggest that his gallery was built on the profits of the slave trade. It kind of felt like the writer was personally offended by the mere suggestion of it, and the article had a very defensive tone. I kept Googling, and I actually found out that in August of 2019, the Tate Gallery themselves invited researchers from the Centre for the Study of the Legacies of British Slave-ownership to share their analysis of Henry Tate's wealth. The full article is going to be linked below, but I'm going to summarise their points here. The article begins by confirming that Henry Tate was 14 years old when the abolition of slavery in the British Empire was passed. He was not a slave owner and there is no evidence that his family owned slaves. However, they claimed that the sugar firm was connected to the slave trade in less direct, however still significant ways. Firstly, the sugar industry on which Tate built his fortune sat on a foundation of slavery. Without slavery in the 17th and 18th century, the British sugar industry would not have existed on the scale that it did. Secondly, after the end of Britain's own slave economy, Britain continued to import sugar from the Caribbean and South America. Slavery was still widely practiced in Brazil and Cuba, and it's likely that the sugar produced in those economies was making its way to British refineries. Thirdly, the sugar imported into Britain from British colonies during this period was grown on estates which were established during the slavery period, however at that point were using wage labour, and I don't think the wages were that great. Fourthly, the monoculture of sugar and land ownership implemented by British firms in the Caribbean in the 19th and 20th century contributed to underdevelopment and impoverishment in the Caribbean. And finally, Tate's collection included artworks which were donated by individuals who either did profit from the slave trade or who literally owned slaves. So to say that Henry Tate didn't own slaves is factually correct, but it's not the whole story. He still massively benefited from the existence of slavery, and the Tate collection was connected to slavery in other ways. And this is quite an uncomfortable truth that we all have to contend with. I personally have benefited hugely from the existence of the Tate's free exhibitions, which I've been going to ever since I was a teenager. So I've benefited from this history as well. I think it was a good thing that Tate commissioned this inquiry, but it's also important to remember that it's merely the first step. I also think that in recent years, the Tate has done a very good job platforming and exhibiting artists of colour who are interested in exploring this relationship between the slave trade, our museums, and race. For example, Kara Walker's Fountain in 2020 and the current Hugh Lock show both do that really well. However, let's not delude ourselves into thinking that Tate has shed its history and is now a super woke organization committed to decolonizing the arts. It's probably not true. Because despite these progressive steps, the question of who funds and who benefits from the Tate Galleries continues to be controversial. The Tate was sponsored by the oil company British Petroleum for 26 years. And in 2016, after a long grassroots campaign of activism, the Tate finally cut ties. In this time period, Tate received a total of £3.8 million from British Petroleum. In 2017, 3 female artists whistle-blew about racism and sexual misconduct from Anthony DeFay, a key donor of the Tate Galleries, whose name was engraved onto the wall of the Turbine Hall. A racist selfie of the donor also went viral. I'm not going to post it here, but you can Google it if you want to. It still took Tate more than 2 years of pressure before they finally decided to cut ties with DeFay and remove his name from the wall. And in 2020, as a result of the pandemic, the Tate made a series of job cuts which disproportionately affected Black and minority ethnic staff. So Tate's origin story is important because if we acknowledge that he benefited from slavery, and in turn we are currently benefiting from the gallery that he built, then it's the Tate's duty and our own duty to make amends for this past, to investigate, to decolonize, to ensure that it's being run in a more ethical way. However, if we just believe that Henry Tate was a really good bloke who had loads of money and decided to build these nice galleries and libraries for the country, then we don't have to do any investigating. The status quo can remain the same. But as we've seen from recent events, there is still an active struggle over how Britain's largest art gallery is funded and who's benefiting from its existence. Thank you very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.